Thank you for indulging me on that meditation. When I was a girl growing up in Wichita, Kansas, my aunt had a friend named Mrs. Bullock. And Mrs. Bullock would come to my aunt's house and they would sit around sometimes and have lunch. And after lunch, Mrs. Bullock would like to sing. And my sisters and I and my cousins, we would of course be in the room, and Mrs. Bullock would start singing a song, maybe Pass Me Not or Blessed Quietness or some other hymn. And she would sing the first verse, and the second, and the third, and then she'd say, one more verse, Artisy, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth. I love that first piece of polyphonic music, the Polynesian example, because just when it gets to the end, you think that they've stopped, and then they start all over again. And I could hear Marion chuckle next to me. She hadn't heard it before. But I know there was almost that nervous laughter of, are they starting again, yet another time? It always catches people by surprise. But I like the examples of the Polynesian piece of polyphonic music and the Bach piece, because what I think it allows us to do is sometimes meditate on what is different in a life, in a world, in communities where we are taught to think about everything being the same. And that's not the nature of life. Life thrives on biodiversity. Life thrives on biodiversity, and so does sound. So does sound. I will tell you also that I typically don't add such highfalutin words like polyphonic in my sermon titles. When Linda asked me for my title a couple of weeks ago, I kind of chuckled when I sent it to her because it sounded rather academic, doing the difficult colon. Compassion and the polyphonic. One never knows quite what to expect with a title like that, does one? But I've been really captured by the idea of the polyphonic here recently. If you know anything about music, you know that music consists of various tonal textures and rhythms and all of these other ideas that make music what it is to us today, and so basic in the human world. But the idea of polyphonic music is quite different. It is different because unlike the typical monophonic music we hear, or hemophonic music, where there is either just one line of melody, or in the latter there is a line of melody with accompanying chords. Polyphonic music, as you heard, has a series of independent tonal textures that exist within the whole of that one piece. But what is so important about them is that they are not dependent upon each other in a way as to not be perfect, or if you take one out, you can't have something there for us to hear. They all exist independently. They are beautiful pieces that come and go, and you have to really listen and be captured by how the music flows. And during the meditation, I hope that you found yourself chasing textures and coming into one and weaving through another and finding that all of these independent textures went to make a whole. The idea of polyphonic music is so interesting, and we think it's so modern because within the Western canon of time, we see it in the Renaissance. But it's far more older than that. In Mongolian and African and Polynesian cultures, this is a very basic way of shaping music around these independent lines of thought. And in our world where we are dealing with so much change and challenges, I've been captured by the idea of the polyphonic. The polyphonic has not just limited itself to ideas around music, but it's in the world of the visual arts. It's in the world of literature. If you were listening in 2015, you would have known that the Nobel Peace Prize was given to the Russian author Svetlana Alexievich. And if you heard the award ceremony that accompanied her prize, they said they gave it to her for her polyphonic writings. Her polyphonic writings, the way in which she used various characters, independent lines of stories and narrative to make a polyphonic whole. When she wrote a book about Chernobyl and the fallout of that disaster, it wasn't just one narrator telling the story, but it was the stories of countless people who had suffered and people who had been affected and people who were first responders and people who did the cleanup behind that devastation. It was a polyphonic work where everybody contributed to the whole, but everybody's part was independent of the whole, but it was essential that everything was included in that work. The reason I am challenging us to think about the polyphonic in the context of compassion, which is something you will be dealing with more this month, is because I think sometimes we have been caught up in the idea that the world is monophonic. That there is one line, there is one melody, there is one thing that we all should abide by. I think if we extend ourselves as compassionate agents in the world with that thought, we're going to lose something because we're missing certain independent elements in this polyphonic whole. Well, what are you talking about, Angela? I'm talking about the idea that these are difficult days. But one of the reasons I think we're dealing with difficult days is because we are challenged to see the world for all the diversity that is present in it. At one point in time, it may have been possible for us to believe that the world was just like Mayberry, with Aunt Bee and Andy and Opie and Barney, who would stop in from time to time for dinner. That was the way of the world. We all lived on Mayberry Street. We were taught that this is the way life was. And then we introduced something that was a buzzword a few years ago. You may have heard people talk about pluralism. We live in a pluralistic, postmodern society. And I always kind of chuckle behind that. Because pluralism wasn't new. The world had always been filled with diversity. The world had always had pockets where people didn't do things the way you did them. The world had always had places where people didn't think the way that I thought. But when we're caught up in the grand narrative that there is one story and we all have to abide by it, we can see how limiting it is and how refreshing it is to think about the world being pluralistic. I think during the time when we were talking about that, we were really talking about beginning to sense the foundations of how we understand the world to be shaking. To understand that the way in which we thought about the world and our communities as Mayberry to be shaking. And what that introduction of pluralism did was to really make us stop and think, well, who's all here in our community? Who's all singing in the choir of life, so to speak? Alexievich, the Soviet writer who won the Nobel Peace Prize, said that she liked to see her books as a choir, but she always listened for the individual. There were always the important elements of different people carrying different truths all across her books. And she said it was essential that we understand that everybody has a piece of truth they carry in the world that they're responsible for. I like that idea of a choir and the polyphonic and difference and challenge and change. It is as if we had this beautiful choir here and we only let one person sing. One person, and all these people was allowed to sing. We would lose all the other voices, the textures, the tones that come into play within the context of the choir. So she says, I look for the individual and I lift that individual up. It is polyphony, the polyphonic in our world today. And the reason I advance this idea of the polyphonic before we talk about compassion is because sometimes I think we move out into compassion without really listening to what's going on in our communities, in our world. Therefore, sometimes our help can be a hindrance. But when you sit and listen, especially to something that is different, like that first song, when you sit and listen and meditate on the places where you hear these lines interrelated and weaving and going off and coming in, you learn something about the whole. And I dare say you even find yourself within the context of the whole. And then Mayberry isn't Mayberry anymore for you. Mayberry is a place where there is a mosque across from the city hall. Mayberry is a place where there are brown and black people going up the street. Mayberry is a place where trans folk don't have to worry about an accessible bathroom. Mayberry is a place where people with disabilities have access to employment and opportunities. Mayberry is a place where you have a woman who's a mayor. That's a little different Mayberry from what we've seen before, isn't it? But when you allow yourself to think about really how different the world is before you step out into the place of compassion, then I believe you step out on common, solid ground. But I'm not a fool about this. I know that it is difficult for us to engage difference, particularly when sometimes we feel threatened by that which we are not familiar with. It is much easier to back away. It is much easier to fall back into hearing that one melody that we always thought was what life was. And when we hear other streams of thought, other tones into the choir of life, we get threatened. Because that's not the way life is. When we look around us today, even in the context of the political atmosphere, we see how so many things have surfaced and we've been challenged to become afraid of all the difference in our world instead of look and listen and step out into compassion. We've been challenged to think in a way of hatred and scarcity as opposed to think about love and compassion. We've been told that it's much easier to be afraid of the person on our left and our right instead of getting to know the person on our left and our right. I think the challenge for our days is to thrive in the polyphonic, to understand that there is difference and each part of that difference has to be appreciated, has to be respected, especially if we're truly going to step out into a place of compassion. I've told people that as a person with a visual impairment, my life is quite different now than it was 13 years ago when I had my full sight. 13 years ago, my world wasn't polyphonic in the sense that I really didn't see people who were blind, and I didn't really have any context for disability. I was like a lot of people, just driving in my car, moving in my world, not really in rhythm to the polyphonic sounds around me. But when I became legally blind, the world shifted. And I understood that there were so many different textures and tones of life that I had missed out on. And when I engage people who want to help me cross the street, I'm reminded of that pre-blind Angela. Because some people will just grab you and move you into the street, or grab you and pull you down into a seat, and not ask that crucial question, may I help you with what you need? The polyphonic is our understanding that our differences don't need to scare us, but they're invitations in getting to know each other and to ask, what is it that you need? How can I assist you? How can I be with you? Compassion. How can I be with you during this space and time? It is even more crucial when things are difficult that we ask those questions and then listen for what we hear, as opposed to just charging off with our compassion like a bull in a china store. The challenge is here because these are difficult times. And we are called to do the difficult, to be compassionate in a world of diversity, when we have to actively engage our ears to hear how other people are moving the world and how we intersect with their lives. I don't pretend that that's easy. I know that it is a challenge for us, particularly if we've never been challenged before to listen to the other tones of the rhythm of life. But it is a challenge well worth our taking on now. When we turn the lens on our own communities and see so many people who are in need of adequate health care, who need affordable housing, who need employment opportunities, who need good schools for their kids, who need safety from police brutality, who need assistance with immigration, who needs freedom from the threats of xenophobia. When we really look at all the realities of our world and the places where we are made different because of our identity, it is difficult. It is difficult, but it is necessary that we engage difference. Engage difference so that we can see how we can move out into compassion to help people. People often make the example or the idea that when I'm talking about difference, I'm talking about a room full of brown, black, white, red, Christian, Jews, Muslims. I'm talking about even the difference that's in this room here today. The difference that maybe you can't see because you've not had an opportunity to get close and to be in conversation with each other and to see what's happened with each other over the last few days since you've been together. The difference of the issues that you're dealing with, and you may be dealing with something and your neighbor right next to you may not be dealing with it, but they don't know. They may not know that this is something that you're dealing with. Compassion invites us to get to know each other, to move it a little closer and listen a little deeper, to ask ourselves what's going on in the midst of our community. What rhythms have we been missing in lines of tonal qualities, textures we've not heard because we've either been too busy, or we make the assumption that everything's okay, or we're not just checked in with each other. It's important that we find ourselves within all these different lines of textures, asking each other, How are you doing? How's it going? How can I get to know you better today? Because it starts even smaller with you. Checking in with the different polyphonic levels within yourself. I tell people that if you think about who you are, you're really a complex universe all unto yourself. And if you think about how you move in the world, then all of those different lines and textures within yourself have to show up. So when people say, well, Angela, who are you? I kind of tease them. I say, well, I'm a colored woman. What do you mean by that? I say, well, I'm a black woman in a rainbow community with a white cane. It speaks to the fact that I know that I'm a black woman. I know that I'm lesbian. I know that I'm blind. And I know that as I move into my polyphonic whole in the world, all of those things have to be supported and appreciated as I move out into places where I engage people where we may have to rub up against each other with different textures and tones. And it's going to be difficult. It may be a little hard for both of us. So you see, I'm not just talking about the polyphonic writings of a Russian author. I'm getting down to the bones of our very bodies. How we ourselves inhabit difference. And it is from that place that we move forward in compassion. If you're familiar with the loving kindness meditation, the Buddhist meditation, you start with yourself. And then you move out in the world. I think the same is true as we're talking about doing the difficult work of being compassionate in a world of difference where we're called to listen. And listen in such a way as to hear all those beautiful elements that we may not have heard before, that may have been different before, that we may have laughed at before, that we may have wanted to finish before, but to engage them in a different way because we realize that in the sense we all are connected in this polyphonic world. And that we find our own tone within the tones of those other beautiful textures in the experience of human thriving. As you continue and think about this idea of compassion and how you might live up to your mission and your goals in this congregation, I challenge you today to start by listening deeply to the places around you, deeply to the people around you, deeply so that you can hear the difference even when things seem to be the same. You can hear the difference and then respond in a compassionate way so as your help becomes that which fuels us forward as opposed to something that hinders us from going forward. Let's do the difficult. Let's extend compassion as we listen deeply in a world of polyphonic rhythm, polyphonic voices, and not move away from each other in a time when we are taught to be afraid of each other, but to move closer, to listen deeper, to be more thoughtful, and hear ourselves in the rhythm of each other's lives. And so it is.